Hello and welcome to a Discourse About Nothing, the only Seinfeld-themed philosophy podcast in the entire world. Let's get her done today, baby! That's a quote from Jerry Seinfeld himself in episode 562 of Seinfeld. I love it when he talks to George and says, "Get it done, get her done." I'm alone today again, just like that other boring episode, and I'm going to try to keep it as concise and to the point as possible, with as much clarity as I possibly can. This is going to be more of a formal lecture style, or presentation style episode, whatever you want to call it. Mini episode, sure. Matt is really busy, so I didn't have a chance to coordinate our schedules to do an episode, and none of my other friends really I've ever talked to about this subject in particular, and it's probably better for me to stay as concise and to the point as I can, to do it myself, to represent these ideas with full clarity instead of getting into a bunch of other directions of conversation that it could go. All I'm going to do today is I'm going to lecture on the meaning of life and how all the other podcast episodes have built up to the central question. I started thinking about doing this just today, just about an hour ago, and I got really anxious and really excited because this is, I think, the most important question any of us could ask ourselves. But it's not just a question, it's a philosophical problem because there are really difficult metaphysical and metaethical difficulties in talking about the meaning of life. And we can, it seems like, get an intuitive grasp of what it would mean for our lives to be meaningful, but it's not clear that our lives can be meaningful given that intuitive concept of meaning or meaningfulness to our lives. I've raised in the first 4 or 5, is it 4 or 5? It's different on iTunes and our website, but the first 4 or 5 episodes of the podcast have all been about metaethics. But they haven't talked about meaning specifically. They've talked about the objectivity and authority of morality. They haven't talked about how meaning factors into that, or how meaning emerges from morality or relates to morality and objective moral values. In the last episode, when I was giving my criticisms of Jordan Peterson, I complained that Peterson gives a lot of practical advice about how to feel that your life is meaningful or how to develop your own self, but doesn't ever give a theory about the good, a positive theory. And without a positive theory of the good or the intrinsically valuable, that is a theory that tells us what is good, what is intrinsically valuable, what ends we should be aiming for, we're completely without direction, and as I'm going to cover in this, completely without meaning. Peterson's whole thing in 12 Rules for Life and a bunch of other work he's done is to kind of prime his audience to think about meaning and purpose and how to discover that, or how to get yourself ready to find meaning and purpose. He talks a lot about the psychological feeling or perception or sense that your life has meaning, but doesn't really talk about what meaning itself is and if we can have it, and if so, how. So instead of just giving a criticism and being a reactor figures, I'm going to actually try to give you some more insight about what meaning is, how it relates to morality, how it relates to the first 4 podcasts, which is 4 or 5 podcasts, which are about the difficulties in discovering whether or not there are objective, authoritative moral truths, moral values, or authoritatively valuable objects in themselves. I was on the Jordan Peterson subreddit, and I was criticizing Jordan Peterson for not giving that view in particular, or not giving any positive theory or positive account of the good. And I got a lot of feedback, and a lot of the feedback from his fans, and I mean a lot, I got in a lot of arguments over this. A lot of the feedback, people were confused about the nature of intrinsic value, of meaning, and they focused a lot, like Peterson does, on the psychological feeling or perception that your life is meaningful, but not whether or not your feeling or perception is right. So I want to set the record straight, maybe post this on Reddit and be a horrible self-aggrandizing, self-advertising butthole, but also for myself, because this is what I'm writing on, what I'm working on. So doing this, instead of just writing a paper no one will read, will help me express my ideas and clarify them so that when I could write a professional paper and try to get it published in a few weeks or a few months, it will be better than if I just sat in silence and contemplated it by myself, because I could get your feedback. But also, I think this discussion could be really helpful to people. This is not a sectarian discussion. This is not a discussion that divides people along religious or political lines. This is something that we should all be concerned about because it's universal. And the only people who would not care about this are people who are disposed to be nihilists. If you're not disposed to be a nihilist, then you've got some skin in the game of what we're talking about right here, even if you don't really care or don't realize it. So I'm just going to jump right in and start talking about meaning and why I think you have to have intrinsic, authoritative, objective values and moral truths to have meaning. Susan Wolf, a philosopher at, I think, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, wrote this paper, Meaningfulness, a Third Dimension of the Good Life. She writes about the meaning of life a lot, which is not very common in analytic or academic Western philosophy because it's such a vague notion, like I've said in the other episodes. What is meaningfulness, as in what makes a life meaningful? Should we even care about our lives being meaningful? Is that a concept that even makes sense? I think she, in this paper, shows that it is a concept that makes sense. It has content, it has meaning, not in the sense of meaning or purpose, but literally in the sense of propositional content about the world. It tries to describe the world. So meaning is a real coherent concept, and the question is whether or not we can and how have meaning and how that relates to morality. I'm going to just assume as granted that having meaning in life is something that we all want, and it's necessary, or at least very likely necessary, for human well-being and psychological flourishing or functioning. This is something that Peterson really latches onto, and I think why he's popular is a lot of people feel completely hopeless, completely meaningless, and his fans, especially what I think of as a lot of young male fans that spend a lot of time on the internet and playing video games, want something more than just their video games, their time on Reddit or whatever, and want this sense of purpose. And I think that's what Peterson starts to give people. I'm just going to take it a little bit farther. Susan Wolf thinks that the intuitive concept of meaning or meaningfulness that most people at least have is that your life or an action is meaningful when it aligns with something of intrinsic value. When your motives align with something of intrinsic value. Here's what her concept of meaning and meaningfulness really means in more detail. Consider this. There are some actions we do with motives that are purely selfish or egotistical. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. I'm saying there are some actions we do, and the reason we do them is because we think they're going to be conducive to our self-interest. Our motive is that we sense that this action has utility for what we want, the goals and values we personally have. So there are some actions that are done from egoistic motives or self-interested motives where you sense the utility of the action. But there are other actions that we do where we have motives where we feel like we act out of obligation or duty. So it's not necessarily that we think it'll benefit us, but that we think we have to do it because that's what morality says, or maybe that's what rationality says. So we believe or we sense or we feel that we have to do it, that we're compelled to do it by morality, whatever morality is. So obligation. And this is typically how people think if they're not too reflective. They think that most of their motives, and maybe most of their motives are either done from egoistic motives, a sense of utility, or duty or obligation motives, that is moral motives, that is a sense of obligation or duty. So your motives that you could have are senses of self-interest and utility, or senses of obligation and duty. But if we introspect and we really think about a lot of the things we do, there's a third category of motives she thinks exist. And those are motives where you sense that even though you don't have to do something, even though it's not required of you, and even though it doesn't help you pursue what you want and your self-interest, you do it out of love. Or in my terms, you do it out of a sense that your action, or whatever your action accomplishes or relates to, is intrinsically valuable. So you positively value your action or the object of your action in itself. It doesn't justify to you, you don't value it because it gets you something, and you don't do it or value it because you have to, because morality says. You do it because you think or you feel like it has objective value, intrinsic objective value. So what Wolf is saying is that our innate or instinctive or intuitive concept of when an action or life is meaningful, let's just deal with actions. An action is meaningful when you do it because you want to, because you value whatever you're doing, or whatever you're doing is directed towards, as intrinsically valuable, as worthy of you caring and loving it for itself. And also, it's actually worthy of doing it or of valuing it. It's actually intrinsically valuable. So the concept of meaning, and I find this really intuitively plausible. This really seems like when I talk about meaning and when I desire meaning in my life, it seems like it's this concept that I'm talking about. My life is meaningful if it's filled with a bunch of actions that I want to do because I love the actions, or I love the things the actions do for themselves, and the actions or the things the actions do actually are worthy of that love. They have intrinsic value. They are intrinsically good without justifying themselves by utility. I should love them, or they're worthy of my love, even though they don't necessarily serve my self-interest, and I'm not even duty-bound to love them. So what a meaningful action is, it's an action done out of love for an object or love for the action that's not based on its utility or how it's good for you. And it's also not based on duty. It's based on you love the thing you're doing. You think it's intrinsically valuable, or you have a psychological positive valuation, as I call it in some of my papers, of the object or act. And also, it happens to be that it's really truly valuable, objectively. So a meaningful action is an action that takes subjective psychological values and lines them up with objective non-psychological values in reality. Someone might object that, well, no, what's good enough for me, what I happen to value, is good enough to make it meaningful. I don't need this notion of objective, mind-independent values that are independent of my opinions, that my psychological values line up with. Okay, maybe that's right, but we're not necessarily talking about what's true. We're talking about what our concept of meaningfulness is. We desire this meaningfulness, and this seems to be what it consists in. And I can illustrate this with a few different points that I'm pulling from Wolf's paper. The first one is just an obvious example. Think about people who find meaning in volunteering. They would all say that their volunteering is meaningful. Okay, why? I think if you ask them, and when I've volunteered, and my wife is finding meaning in starting to volunteer with animals now, you ask them why, and it's, well, because I really love, let's say, working with animals. Why do you love working with animals? Well, it doesn't give her anything. The pleasure she takes in it is because she loves the animals in themselves. They don't have any utility for her. She loves them. Okay, well, I also asked her, well, do you think that your love for them is greater than just your own preference? Should other people love them? Is there something more than just your own psychological opinion or valuation? And she said, well, yeah, if there wasn't, then why would I care? I take it that my love for them is somehow linked to what I think everybody should feel about them, that they have real objective value. So there's a really close linking here. If the meaning my wife gets from volunteering with animals is that she positively values them in themselves, and doing things to help them and seeking their good is seeking the good of something that is intrinsically valuable, and it's not just her opinion of it. And that seems like objective values, right? So that's one thought experiment or case study, whatever you want to call it. Here's another thought experiment, and it's the myth of Sisyphus, which is in Camus, titled The Myth of Sisyphus, his book. But it's also just an old myth, and Susan Wolf mentions it. Okay, imagine this dude Sisyphus is destined by the gods forever to roll this gigantic boulder up a hill. That's all he's allowed to do for the rest of his life, or even for all eternity. He just has to roll this boulder up a hill. That's his only thing to do. Okay. Would we look on him and say, what a meaningless existence, what a meaningless, terrible life. It's worthless, it's meaningless, it's purposeless. I would say that, and I think a lot of other people would. Why? Well, it seems to be because our concept of meaningfulness tells us that his rolling the boulder up the hill serves no purpose. That action has no meaning. Okay, why do we feel that action has no meaning? I think it's because that action, rolling a stone up a hill, most people, or us, sense that there's no significance to that action. That action doesn't have any importance or value. Rolling a boulder up a hill isn't good. It doesn't accomplish anything, right? So it has no utility. And if it has no utility, the only other type of value it could have is intrinsic value. But we sense that it doesn't have intrinsic value. And I think those two facts, or those two opinions that we have, or inclinations we have, lead us to judge that rolling the boulder up the hill is a meaningless action. And if Sisyphus's life is just a bunch of rolling the boulder up a hill a bunch of times, then it's completely meaningless. So the meaninglessness of Sisyphus's life, our intuition says, is that consists in all of his actions are meaningless. And his actions being meaningless are him rolling the thing up the hill has no intrinsic value. Okay, now this is what Wolf does. She takes it a step further. Imagine that Sisyphus really, really, really enjoys rolling the boulder up the hill for all eternity, or for the rest of his life. But that's still all he does, but he really enjoys it. So he's happy, or his life is pleasurable. Okay, so you have Sisyphus for all eternity, or the rest of his life, rolling the boulder up his hill, and it brings him some sort of pleasure. Is his life still meaningless? Okay, I would say yes, and I think a lot of other people would. Now, if you won't say yes, if you think happiness is it, then I'm not going to argue with you right now, because I'm not arguing whether you're right or wrong at this point. I'm trying to expose the concept of meaningfulness that we innately or instinctively or intuitively have. So if that's right, then, and if that's what our intuition indicates, and I cannot doubt personally that is my concept of meaningfulness and meaning. I can't doubt that this is what my reaction is. This is the concept I'm operating under. I can't doubt that I personally desire meaningfulness. I can doubt, however, that everybody does, or most people do, right? So maybe it's just a quirk of mine. But I think that given this thought experiment, if we say that even if it makes them happy rolling the boulder up the hill, it's still a meaningless life and meaningless actions, we have to ask why. And I think it's because happiness and pleasure doesn't make your life meaningful. What makes your life meaningful is connecting your happiness and pleasure with something intrinsically valuable. And these are just a bunch of intuition pumps or thought experiments that draw out this concept that we have within us. And I think it's pretty accurate. So I think the meaningfulness we take to be so important and desire is that your actions, and that your life is filled with actions, and your actions take your pleasures, your intrinsic pleasures, so your actions that you do because you really love them or because you love the object of your actions, and it links those up with or matches them to the truth of the matter, the objective truth of the matter, that it really does have intrinsic value. So let's move on. Let's take it that I've established that that's our intuitive concept. And let's also just keep assuming that that sort of meaning is highly desirable, really important. I just knocked over my lens. Really important and essential to human well-being and flourishing. So what's essential to well-being and flourishing? Well, it's being able to have and do actions and have projects and goals that you love because you think they're intrinsically valuable, and at the same time believing or sensing that they truly are intrinsically valuable. Now we get into the philosophical, meta-ethical, and metaphysical problems, and this is what causes all of my depression and angst, pretty much. Okay, so there's moral disagreement about what is valuable and what's not, even with intrinsic values. Some people don't value other human beings and murder them. Some people get pleasure from murdering and raping other human beings and doing all sorts of terrible things. And then in more ordinary issues, you pick up a guitar and want to play rock and roll, like Susan Wolf mentions, and your family thinks it's just a waste of time because they don't think music or rock and roll is intrinsically valuable. Okay, so one of you is saying that something is intrinsically valuable. One of you is saying that something's not intrinsically valuable. Those seem like meaningful assertions of the form P or not P. You're saying this is meaningful and intrinsically valuable, and this is not. Okay, one of you have to be wrong. Which one is it? And so we worry that, well, maybe this disagreement exposes that it's all just my preferences. There's no objectively intrinsically valuable things. It's just my preferences. Because if it wasn't just my preferences, wouldn't they be able to see the same thing I'm seeing and value it? Wouldn't the serial killer or rapist not want to hurt other people if they're truly valuable and it's not just our opinion? Why can't I explain to him why? Why can't I explain to my parents why rock and roll is a good thing? Or I mean, for a lot of us in philosophy, to our families, why philosophy is a good thing. A lot of people seem to have no conception of intrinsic value even. A lot of people I talk to go back talking about my career, what are you going to do with philosophy? And when I say, well, it doesn't matter what I'm going to do, philosophy's good in itself, it's intrinsically valuable. Pursuing knowledge, wisdom, and truth is intrinsically valuable. They just look at me like I'm crazy or have these weird ideas I'm just pulling out of my ass. And after I finish pulling my pants up and stop pulling ideas out of my ass, I ask them, like, why don't you see this? And they have no response. They just don't care. They don't care. They don't care, Jerry! Okay, sorry for blowing out your speakers. But the problem is now that we're starting to doubt whether or not things really actually have intrinsic value. And if they don't have intrinsic value, and we desire meaningful lives and meaningful actions and projects, then we can never get what we desire. We desire meaning, but meaning requires objective intrinsic values that we can align our own preferences with. But if there are no objective intrinsic values, then we can't align our subjective or psychological values and valuations with something more objectively intrinsically valuable, so we can't have meaning. Do you get it? Do you see? This is what's frustrated me with almost everyone in my life. I talk about intrinsic values, and now I'm starting to get pissed. Excuse me being pissed, but I talk about intrinsic values, and I have no conception of them. Probably it has to do with American capitalism, but it's all about utility. What's going to make you money? What's going to get you places? What's going to further your career? But guess what? Your career is meaningless per our concept of meaning if there are no intrinsic values. You cannot justify the meaningfulness of your career or your monetary success without positing some intrinsic values. Unless you want to completely change your concept of meaningfulness, but then if you do that, then you're just talking about something completely different, and who cares at that point? We so strongly desire this sort of meaning, as displayed in the myth of Sisyphus thought experiment, and the facts about volunteering, and a bunch of other things. Just introspect. We so clearly and strongly need, for our psychological health, meaning and purpose. But once we recognize that there are no objectively, intrinsically valuable things that we could pursue in our projects and actions, then it all just drops out. Like William James and Tolstoy said, you realize that there's no intrinsic value beyond yourself or objectively, and for some reason, for whatever reason, it just makes you not care anymore, or it makes you care less. In my criticism of Jordan Peterson, it's because my main criticism was that he focuses on the psychological feeling or sense of meaning, but he doesn't actually get you to the point where you could say, yeah, my life has meaning, because to get to that point, and to feel that way when you're being intellectually honest with yourself, you would have to really believe and feel like there are objective intrinsic values outside me. And Peterson never addresses that. No one ever addresses that in pop culture. Nobody. They just either assume it as a given, or they just, for some reason, don't care and don't reflect on it. And it's very frustrating. Okay, so calming down now. Getting less angry. Trying to not throw up because I've had coffee and a sandwich, and I'm yelling, and I don't feel very good today, and I've been up since 5 a.m. Trying not to throw up. Let's look at our options. Okay, we can deny the importance of meaning. We can deny that this is really what we desire and think is important, that this concept of meaning isn't really fully capturing it. Or we could essentially just say, I don't care. I'm done. I don't care. I'm just going numb. And that last one doesn't seem like a good option to me, and I think most of us aren't capable of it. I'm starting to get ramped up again. God. So I think the two options, if you doubt that there are objective intrinsic values, are to deny the importance of meaning or deny that we've described the concept correctly. Or, the classical and religious and more metaphysical rather than the purely narrow-minded materialist way of thinking about this is there is the good. There are objective intrinsic values, and you come up with some plausible theory of that to justify it to yourself, right? And while still being intellectually honest. And again, that's what William James thought the function of religion was, not just theistic religions, but religion in general, including weird spiritual movements. So when I read on these Reddit arguments, Jordan Peterson fans going, well, I don't really need anything transcendent above us. We don't need a positive account of the good. It's like, well, wait, then you don't have meaning. The whole point of 12 Rules for Life and all these other things is to prime you for meaning, but why prime yourself for something that doesn't exist if you're not willing to go the step further and start thinking about intrinsic value, the good? The good is just that which explains why or how things are intrinsically valuable. Because Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics defines the good as that which explains why everything that is good is good. Not to be too much of a downer, but this is the thing I've been working on. This is why I'm a Christian. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, or at least trying to convert to one and become a member of the church. This is why I do philosophy. This is why I live at all, is to find out if there's meaning. Because for me, if there's not meaning in this sense, then life isn't worth living. And I can't exactly explain succinctly exactly why life isn't worth living, if that's true. But I do have a big 36-page paper that I'm trying to get published on it right now, and I'll link it in this, and it's also in the paper section on notdiscourse.com, which is a podcast website, that you could look for more details on that, if you want to slog through 36 pages of my writing. So, deny the importance of meaning, deny that we've analyzed meaning, the important concept of meaning correctly, or believe in intrinsic values and come up with some theory about them. All right, I've already mentioned the first difficulty. I just punched my mic. First difficulty with intrinsic values is that there's people who disagree. Why would we expect disagreement if intrinsic values existed? Wouldn't we all be able to sense them or see them or agree on them? The other difficulties are that how could we get in touch with this strange reality through evolution? Why would we think that through evolution, through this long process, it just so happened to be that our moral faculties made us capable of apprehending this third realm, or this additional realm, this moral reality that's not just in our heads, right? One of my favorite professors right now in my master's program has a couple articles on this that I'll link as well, the evolutionary reliability problems. Okay, and the other one is going to be similar to the first one about disagreement, but this one's the one that strikes me. Okay, in those last podcasts, I talked about how moral truths and intrinsic values are linked to reasons or rationality. So whenever I say that this is intrinsically valuable, don't I also have to say that, well, then there's a good, compelling moral reason to value it, right? I'm justified in valuing it. And don't I also have to say that, well, if this thing is really intrinsically valuable, then shouldn't people value it? Shouldn't other people value it, not just me? But the problem is that assumes there are these reasons to value things that don't have anything to do with your individual preferences or desires, or even your well-being necessarily. That there are these reasons, they're called external, non-instrumental moral reasons, and this is also covered in my big paper that hopefully will turn into my master's thesis. But it seems like objective intrinsic values require that there are reasons to value them that are independent of your opinions. So they're external from you, and they're not about utility. But as J.L. Mackie points out, and you could Google search J.L. Mackie queerness argument, aren't those sorts of reasons and these metaphysical moral objects very strange? Like, what the hell are they? We can't describe them. We're not in touch with them. We can't taste, touch, hear, feel them. We have to posit this strange moral sense that gets us in tune with other things. And then you combine that with the problem of evolutionary reliability, and it's like, well, that seems like a knockdown case against moral realism, or believing that there are objective intrinsic values and objective external non-instrumental reasons to value some things. But then also, if there were good reasons to value something, why would other people, again, not be able to get in touch with them? Why could they not see the reasons that are right in front of their face and I can? Isn't that sort of elitist or something? And we worry about that sort of thing. So these are all, I think, the main difficulties. And I don't really have a good answer for them right now. But I don't know if I ever will, because no one's come up with, in my mind, good answers yet. But it's so important that we can't just say, well, yeah, we shouldn't believe in it, because then what's the point of living? There's no meaning in life. None of the things you care about or do are really objectively valuable. They don't have intrinsic value. And one of the consequences of that, again, this is in my big ass paper, is say there's a psychopath that doesn't care about what you care about. How do you convince them, without positing intrinsic values, that they shouldn't kill you or rape you or kill your child or rape your child? How do you convince somebody that doesn't care? If it just boils down to your preferences or human preferences, why are the preferences of the sociopath or psychopath inferior to the preferences of other human beings? You can't just say, well, because more people agree with me than do the sociopath. Why? Who cares? Why should I care about agreement? You've got to give me some intrinsic value or some external, non-instrumental reason to care about your value system, or what the value system of human beings in general are, that sets it apart from the psychopath or sociopath. And if you can't do that, that seems to cast doubt on the whole notion of intrinsic values, and then would logically result in there is no meaning. We can never have meaning. And I, for one, could not bear to live knowing that. There are a lot of other consequences of denying intrinsic values. And also, I mean, those are the same consequences, I think, of denying external, non-instrumental moral reasons. And I punch my mic again. Those are in the paper that I'll link. I'm not going to mention those because I'm already going longer than I thought I would. Okay, so just quick summary. Susan Wolf and I and a bunch of other people think that meaning consists of a life full of actions that are meaningful. And meaningful actions are actions where you value something or sense that something's intrinsically valuable. And it also is, in reality, objectively. So there's a union in meaningful actions and meaningful lives of psychological preferences and objective or real or actual values and reasons. I hope this helps summarize the first 4 or 5 episodes of the podcast for anybody that actually listens. But also, I hope this maybe at least helps one person understand the structure of their values more, and of morality and of meaning more. I especially hope that Jordan Peterson fans latch on to the sort of thinking that I'm saying, expand their horizons, and start delving into the meaning with more substance and morality with more substance. Because I think if we could all start thinking like this and ditch a super utilitarian way of thinking where everything has to be justified on utility, I think we could solve a lot of political and social disputes. It would do some real moral good, because I genuinely think that people that disagree with a lot of the policies that I agree with, and this is, I'm sorry, I'm just going to be honest, I think you are not just looking at different evidence. I think you don't care enough about the intrinsic value of other human beings. So let's try to discover what is intrinsically valuable together so that we could come to agreement on it, expose exactly why we are adopting the policies that we are adopting and encouraging. So here's a very concrete problem. Should you lean towards a way less regulated free market like the one we have right now, or should you go to a more socialistic, which these terms are almost, I'm not pitting capitalism against socialism. That's a BS division, right? But should we more heavily regulate the market and corporations? Okay, my arguments for that will be based on the intrinsic dignity of the human person, and I think that the priority and the function and purpose of government, and this lines up perfectly with Lockean liberalism, is to help and encourage human beings to flourish because human beings are intrinsically valuable. And that the function of government is just utilitarian. It's just to help intrinsically valuable human beings and life forms flourish. So the priority of any policy you put in place should have to be conducive to actualizing some intrinsic good or value. That is, human beings. Okay, well, I think you can infer some things from that. For one, I think you can infer that whatever economic policy you put in place, it has to be for the good of mankind. All right, well, I think it's pretty clear that letting corporations run amok and lobby and have inordinate amount of influence is, when you really consider it, a violation of the good of human beings and mankind. And if you can't see that, I don't think that you're looking at different evidence. I think you're not being reflective enough about the nature of what is valuable. Buying things and being a consumer and making money isn't valuable. Human life is, human flourishing is, the life of the mind is, art is, and those aren't things that corporations give you. In fact, they brainwash you with advertisements to not care about art, to not care about originality, to not care about the aesthetic virtues that we'll probably end up doing another episode soon on anyway. But the point of what I'm saying is, a typical conservative reply to a more leftist argument for more regulation or for certain economic policies is that infringes the freedom of corporations and business people to make money. Okay, that's not as intrinsically valuable as a human being's life as the environment's well-being. Because in part, I think the environment and nature is intrinsically valuable in itself because it's part of God's creation, and God's creations are intrinsically valuable. But at the same time, I think it also has, the environment's well-being has utility to human beings. So the freedom to make money and to maximize profits is not, in my mind, anywhere close to the dignity and intrinsic value of the human being or God's creation. So what frustrates me is that a lot of conservatives appeal to I think the intrinsic value of business or whatever, or the ability to make money. And that's not a knockdown argument. And I think it's because you're not being reflective enough about what really matters. These obviously aren't Matt's views, I don't think. I'm not sure. These are only my opinions and views, right? Take them with a grain of salt, but also take them with a little bit more than a grain of salt. Right, a little bit less than a grain of salt, because I actually have studied this for like 7 years now, and I'm doing it more, so I kind of know what I'm talking about. But at the same time, I want to say one more thing to leave off with, and I know I'm running now over 40 minutes, which is gross, and probably no one will listen to this. So my final thoughts I'm going to leave you with is a sketch of a moral argument for the existence of God. And it goes like this. Look. If there's a supremely perfect, all-powerful being, which is God, right? That's what I'm defining as God. Then he would not let us develop moral faculties that were purely deceiving us. This sort of argument goes back to Descartes and even further back. But our moral faculties, even if through evolution, would somehow be guided, or God would choose a world where evolution ends up giving us reliable faculties. But also, if the Christian religion is true, and God really did, the divine really did become man, and Jesus died and resurrected with all of the history of his teachings, then you have a historical, empirical verification of our moral sensibilities and faculties and systems from the divine, from a supremely perfect being. If the resurrection happened, then you have a vindication of all of Jesus' teachings, and guess what? Jesus' core teachings lines up with what I'm saying, in that humans are intrinsically valuable, God is intrinsically valuable, there are intrinsic values, there is meaning and purpose in life, there are objective moral truths that are authoritative over us, and if God really exists, I think we have a guarantee of that. But it's not just that, we have further reassurance given Christianity's truth that that's correct, because God came down, endorsed by becoming incarnate our moral systems, and then died and as proof resurrected. That reassures me somewhat. And so I think that it's so difficult coming up with an account of the good and explaining how certain things can be intrinsically valuable. The existence of God and the truth of the Christian religion, at least for me, in these beginning stages of trying to find a solution to this, it at least gives some reassurance that there are objective moral values. And no other system that I've found personally convinces me other than that. And that's why I'm religious. That is the reason I'm religious. I'll link to some books on historical arguments for the resurrection, articles, but that's a big topic, and I know a lot of people listening to this will probably think I'm a quack at this point, but not for being religious, but for specifically saying these things about that I think there is evidence for the resurrection. But that's a thing for another episode. Okay, so thanks for everybody who listened to this. Sorry that it was so long. Hopefully you got something from it. At least it puts it on record, my thoughts, in a more accessible form than gigantic 40-page papers. But anyway, I'll probably do this thing where I ask my friends and family and people on the internet for audio responses, and then I'll put a follow-up episode to this of people responding to what I've said here to get the opinions and input of people who aren't brainwashed by analytic philosophy and theology. All right, thanks. Have a good night.